Hello everyone and welcome to our 28 Disruptive Fridays. We are happy to have you with us on the first live edition for 2022. Today, you will be able to hear about the inequalities in COVID-19 vaccine distribution and the increasing transparency in the funding of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And with us we have Sarai, Keestra and Til Bruckner. This is all part of the project Challenging Corruption, Empowering Future Voices, which started in October 2021. The project is funded by the GIZ, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, as commissioned by the government of the Federal Republic of Germany. So as I mentioned, the moderator of this edition is Til Bruckner. He is the founder of TranspariMED, a campaign that works to end evidence distortion in medicine. And now I would like to give the floor to Til Bruckner to guide us through this talk. The floor is yours, Til.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us today. And I think we all just want to go straight into the substance of it, so I'll keep this really short. I want to introduce Sarai Keestra a little bit more. She's currently doing a PhD at the University of Amsterdam. She's been working as a volunteer with Universities Allied for Essential Medicines for many years now. And Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, or UAEM, they focus on access to medicines and vaccines worldwide. And I think it fits really nicely into the Disruptive Fridays series because you're talking about inequality, you're talking about corruption, but you're also talking about transparency and democracy when you're talking about access to medicines and vaccines. And what UAEM do chiefly is focus on the roles that universities play in medical innovation. And why I think that they're really exceptional is because they're a group of students, a group of volunteers who've managed to make a really, really big impact through their work. And you've got a really loud voice in debates around access to medicines. And more we're seeing a world in which campaigners are professionals. They're from the same class and they've got essentially the same jobs as bureaucrats, as politicians. And UAEM really stands out as a fresh voice of people who manage to make a difference unpaid in their spare time, just through intelligence, enthusiasm and drive. And I think Sarai Keestra is a really good example of that sort of exceptionalism. She combines like the talents of a researcher and the talents of a campaigner, which is quite rare. So she's got an in-depth understanding of the issues, but she also knows how to bring those issues to public attention. So on that note, I'll hand over to you, Sarai.
Well, thank you, Til, for this wonderful introduction. And I'm very happy to talk to you today about inequalities in COVID-19 vaccine distribution. So what exactly are we going to cover this session? So in this session, we'll talk about a case study about how we as a group of student activists and early career researchers have aimed to change the discourse around the global equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines by increasing transparency in public funding for COVID-19 vaccine development at our own institution, the University of Oxford. But first, I wanted to give you a little bit of update on what the current state is of global COVID-19 vaccine inequalities. So let me move on then to a little map where you can see how we're currently doing on COVID-19 vaccinations. So as of yesterday, there have been 363 million cases of corona worldwide and 5.6 million deaths. We have had 9 billion vaccine doses administered, but as you can see on this map, there is some areas where much more vaccines have been administered as in others. And as you can see, some of the countries that are particularly lacking are low-income countries. And as the United Nations Secretary General has put it, it is really an obscenity. We passed the science test and developed a vaccine, but we're getting an F in ethics. So I want to explore this a little bit further, where the inequality lies. So if we look at high income countries, at the moment, there is about more than 70% in most high-income countries have received their vaccines and even received their booster shots. Whereas in low-income countries, we see that around 5% of people are vaccinated. So whilst vaccines pour into higher income countries, only a tiny amount of these vaccines have reached the lower income areas of the world. A lot of the problems here have also been that the high-income countries are buying way more vaccines than they actually need, and they promise to donate vaccine doses to low-income countries. But to give the example of the Netherlands, where I come from, of the promised 27 million doses they promised to donate, they have only given away 665,000 so far. This despite the fact that a worldwide rollout of a suitable vaccine would save the global economy $13 million for every day the pandemic is shortened, let alone what we can save in human lives. So what is at issue here in this inequality? As Dr. Tedros, the director of the World Health Organization, has put it, manufacturers are prioritizing bilateral deals and many high-income countries are tying up the global supply of vaccines. I would say that the ongoing inequality in vaccine distribution remains one of the greatest failures of international cooperation during the global coronavirus outbreak. Although vaccine experts have identified over 100 companies with the potential to make mRNA COVID vaccines throughout the world, currently the companies that hold the monopoly on the know-how to make these mRNA vaccines are not willing to share this knowledge, as they're currently very much profiting from the status quo. So, estimate of the People's Vaccine Alliance reveals that the companies behind two of the most successful COVID-19 vaccines, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, are making a combined profit of $65,000 every minute. This, despite very important early investment into the research and development of vaccine technologies that came from public funding. Indeed, it is estimated that this might be as much as $8 billion or even more. However, the three corporations have refused calls to urgently transfer vaccine technology and know-how to capable producers in low and middle income countries via the World Health Organization. Although this move might increase global supply, drive down prices, and save millions of lives. For the discussion of this session, I want to talk about, this slide didn't end up as it was planned. Anyway, I want to talk to you about three key bottlenecks in COVID-19 vaccine inequalities around the research and development, looking at who funds the research and on what terms it is shared, around the legal implication, who controls the intellectual property rights and who profits from the status quo, and around manufacturing, who controls the technical know-how and who has the funds to repurpose existing manufacturing facilities. In essence, the barriers towards worldwide vaccinations lay bare structural inequalities in the way that resources, knowledge, and power is distributed in the world. Indeed, there is a systematic neglect of investment in pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity, especially for biologics and vaccines in the global south. Some of the main barriers include funding and a profit-driven biomedical innovation system that is catered towards creating profitable IP monopolies rather than public health benefits. The main barrier I want to focus in the case study that follows is the lack of transparency in the funding of the early research and development of such vaccines. So I'm part of an organization that is called Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, and we take as an issue that between a third and a quarter of all medicines originate in a university lab. Universities are publicly funded institutions and a place where many of us study and work at. And we think that we should have the power to decide what happens with the result of this public investment and take responsibility of what happens at our own institution. So basically, we got together as a group of students and early career researchers because we were very much interested in the vaccine that was developed at the University of Oxford. That was actually one of the first COVID-19 vaccines that came to market and has been used in 178 countries and territories. Basically, the vaccine relies on 2 decades of research at the Jenner Institute of the University of Oxford. And we saw that there was a lot of funding announcement from the government coming in of millions of pounds that were put into the development and manufacturing of the 𝗤𝗂𝗄𝗏 COVID-19 vaccine, as it is called. We were furthermore interested in how this vaccine was developed because it has a potential to be applied to other diseases of global health interest, at least the vaccine technology underlying it. And we were also very much interested to find out how the University of Oxford decided to commercialize this health technology. So we got together as a group of students to assess the transparency of research funding using, on the one hand, a systematic search of the literature and also a thing called FOIs. So what is an FOI? An FOI, or Freedom of Information Request, allows you to access information held by public authorities, such as the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, but many other countries also have freedom of information laws in place. This means that you can request anything such as printed documents, computer files, letters, emails, photographs, sounds, video recordings. And this allows for you to get real insight into what is happening at such a public institution. So basically, we filed a Freedom of Information request to the University of Oxford for them to disclose all grants that had been received by the 2 main researchers of the 𝗤𝗂𝗄𝗏 vaccine technology. And we then compared it with what we could find in the literature. So in the literature, we could not identify the amounts of many of the grants that had been received and acknowledged in the publications around this vaccine technology. But when we looked at the data that came in from the Freedom of Information requests, very interesting picture emerged, where especially overseas government and charities paid the majority of the research and development funding of the 𝗤𝗂𝗄𝗏 technology, whereas at the moment when the pandemic started, we define this as January 2020 onwards, the UK government stepped in and provided a lot of funding. What is the implication of knowing this? So the implication of this is that the 𝗤𝗂𝗄𝗏 research and development, at least the very early development at the University of Oxford, which is also the most risky development, was largely publicly funded. This kind of provides evidence against the argument that vaccines need to be very expensive because research and development investment needs to be recouped for private vaccine manufacturers, considering that public funding really covered the most risky part of the development of the vaccine technology. It's furthermore an argument to put better public interest conditions on publicly financed research. And what we furthermore have argued is that transparency and reporting of research funding from institutions, funders, and industry really needs to increase, because we were very lucky in having been able to do a Freedom of Information request to understand the public funding base of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. However, it's much harder to identify all the public funding that has gone into the mRNA vaccine technologies and that have been given to biotech companies to stimulate mRNA innovation. So how has this been useful? So this has been really useful to change the discourse around the funding of major vaccines, and especially to challenge a narrative that is very prevalent, that private vaccine manufacturers allowed us to develop a COVID-19 jab, which has also been perpetuated by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. But we kind of showed that actually public investment, even by the UK government itself, has been very important in driving forward the development of this vaccine technology. And this message has also been picked up by the World Health Organization, that acknowledged in this report that a lot of health innovation actually happens by the public sector taking the lead in the most risky basic research. And with this note, I want to open the discussion to talk today about inequalities in COVID-19 vaccine distribution and the way that these vaccines have been researched.
Yeah, thank you, Sarai. Super interesting. Before we open the floor to questions from the people who've joined us, I just wanted to go back to one thing. So you're saying that essentially the taxpayers are paying for medical research. That medical research is then passed on to a company, and that company then privatizes the medicine, if you want, or privatizes the know-how. And then you mentioned monopoly power. So if a company has a monopoly on a vaccine, how are the prices of these things determined?
Well, thank you very much for this question. So the prices are determined in great secrecy, and it's never released in the public domain why a vaccine is priced a certain way. We usually also don't know how much it actually costs to produce it, and we never know how much it actually costs to develop the whole vaccine in the first place. There is especially also a lack of transparency around the cost of the clinical development, information of which is rarely ever in the public domain. So actually, we never really know how expensive vaccines are. But beyond that, we don't even know what governments really are paying for the vaccines, because this information is also not made public and is also dealt with great secrecy. And from the few cases where we do know how much governments paid for certain vaccines, this is not necessarily COVID vaccines, but other vaccines, we know that there is great inequality in how much different countries are made to pay, because this very much relies on the negotiating power of the government to get a good price for their country.
Okay, I'm just going to pull you up on that really quickly. So you say we don't know how much our governments are paying for the vaccines, but as a citizen of a democracy, I can see what the government is paying for other things. I mean, I can see what the government is paying for airports. I can see what the government is paying for other public contracts, for public procurement. I can see all these data. Why can't we see this specifically for vaccines, or is this the case for all medicines?
Actually, this is the case for a lot of medicines and vaccines. Like, we really do not know what countries pay. This is because of the 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝗧 monopoly, where a company holds a lot of power, because if a government makes too much fuss over the pricing of a medicine, they can pull it off the market in a particular country. I think it's particularly glaring how much government funding has contributed to the de-risking of the development of the COVID-19 vaccines. To begin with, governments really fund a lot of the medical research that leads to vaccine development, because it's not a very profitable area, but an area of great public health interest. So an area that typically is very heavily publicly funded. Then governments have engaged in the advanced purchasing of vaccine doses of vaccines that hadn't even been developed at the time. But they already promised, okay, but we're going to pay for this and this many vaccines. And once it comes to market, we expect this and this many vaccines to be delivered. But in some cases, when a COVID vaccine then doesn't work out, they never get their money back from that. And then thirdly, there has been huge tax breaks where companies that have produced COVID-19 vaccines do not have to pay as much taxes on their profits to incentivize further vaccine development. And finally, it has also been the case that governments have taken liability for all kinds of adverse events that might happen due to the early rollout of the vaccines. And this is, again, a way that the government is really supporting the development of these COVID-19 vaccines, but it's not really known at what cost that is to the public.
Okay, and how would you change that?
How will we change that? Well, that's a really big question, because there's so many ways to re-envision the way we do medical research and development. But most importantly would be for more transparency along this whole process, and for this transparency to happen at an international level. So some years ago, before the pandemic, there was a resolution at the World Health Organization level which suggested that we should really increase transparency about research and development costs, but also how much different governments pay to purchase different medicines in different localities. However, first of all, this resolution was very much watered down, and then in the end, it was not adopted in the way that it was intended. So I think the way forward is really to address these issues at an international level and really increase transparency around this. We have been lucky to have this case study where we looked at the University of Oxford and were able to identify some of the ways that they funded their early development and have data on that. But this is really an exception. In general, this is a very opaque thing that is happening. And I think that we as citizens, as taxpayers, as contributors to these charities, but also as academics, as students, should really take more responsibility in demanding more transparency on where these funds come from, where they're going, and also who contributed to the development of new health technologies such as COVID-19 vaccines.
Okay, let's open this up now to questions from our participants. We're waiting, people. Sarai is at your service. So, while you're busy typing away, what's the biggest challenge you've faced? Because you're a student group that's essentially taking on an industry that's got a turnover of, I think, $1 trillion a year, that is famous for its lobbying power, for its political power. How do you go about that as a group of volunteers challenging that kind of overwhelming power?
Yeah, it can definitely be a very overwhelming experience. However, I would say that the benefit of being in a group like Universities Allied for Essential Medicines is that we have a very targeted approach. So we want to start very local at our own universities. And what we try to do there is really address the way that universities themselves engage in the process of commercializing research that happens at the university. So typically, when there is a great invention that is made at a university, we will get, the university will get a patent on that. And then the question is really what the university does in the technology transfer of that patent to private industry. So there's different modes of technology transfer. I'll give two examples. So first of all, the patent can be licensed to a private company. This means that the private company can develop it further. And this license can either be exclusive, so the company is the sole right holder to really develop this technology further, or it can be non-exclusive. So, for example, a university can give the license to different generic manufacturers to develop it further. And then there's also spin-off companies. And basically what we're trying to do as an organization is convince our universities to really make sure that there is important access conditions attached to this whole process. For example, universities can have an influence on the downstream pricing of health technologies, but also on the ways that they're shared and distributed, and also the way that the intellectual property rights are enforced or not enforced in certain territories. So that is kind of the small but large focus we take as an organization.
And for people outside Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, we just got a question in, when you're demanding more transparency, should people primarily target their governments and demand more transparency, or should they focus on companies?
I think a bit of both. I think we definitely have more of a democratic right to challenge our government, right, to more transparency. And I think this is a very important process. But I think it's also very important to challenge like these multinational corporations that might seem too big to tackle. But then if we unite together across different countries and we really do draw lines and say, okay, until here, but not further, I think that's very, very powerful as well. So I think it can go in either direction, but I think that particularly governments should be more transparent, because this transparency will also unite them in being able to challenge these multinational corporations. Because once they're transparent to each other, countries can learn from each other's experiences. And it's really important for countries to know how much their neighbors are paying for certain health technologies or COVID-19 vaccines and share their experiences therein. But this is currently protected by secrecy, and this is hindering the democratic power. And I think that's important to address.
Okay, we've got a series of questions coming in now. I'll pick out one at random. So you're trying to sort of change the narrative, really, around medicines, about innovation. Can you tell us a bit more about how you work to change the narrative based on your findings?
Right. So I think what was very important about the research we did on the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is to really show how far the vaccine was already developed by the time it was transferred to private industry, to really show that Oxford made a great effort to ensure access to the vaccine. And that this is not necessarily due to AstraZeneca itself, but that Oxford actually made very important promises at the beginning of the pandemic to ensure that any research coming out of the university would be affordably priced. There can be debates in how far that has actually been enacted. And again, there is a lack of transparency around that. But what I do see is that a university can make a huge difference in the way that a vaccine is then priced and rolled out. And I think it's very important to highlight these experiences and thereby change the narrative and show that a university actually does have the power to address these technology transfer issues.
It's good that you mentioned power, because we've got a question now that goes through Foucault to power, and that is knowledge. So you mentioned that the companies refuse to transfer the know-how to the global south, but someone now has this great question: how can we decolonize the science that's necessary for developing vaccines, seeing that the education for this knowledge is centralized in the global north?
Yeah, so this is a huge issue, because once you start looking at access to medicines and you kind of go back up a level, then in the end, it's really about the way that we distribute power, knowledge, resources, education. And that is why access to medicines is such an important and issue to talk about, and touches on so many structural inequalities. So what is currently happening is that, to give an example, right, is that Moderna has said that during the pandemic, they will not enforce their patents on their COVID-19 vaccine, which has been a huge theoretical opportunity for other companies to make mRNA vaccines and to vaccinate the world. However, what we see is that Moderna says, okay, we're not going to sue anyone who is going to make our vaccine, but they're not explaining to anyone either how to make the vaccine, despite urgent calls from the World Health Organization to share the recipe. So what has happened now is that in different places, and especially in South Africa, the World Health Organization has their set up technology transfer hub, where they kind of want to have the centralized transfer of knowledge on how to make mRNA vaccines. But because Moderna is not sharing the recipe, what's instead happening is that now in South Africa, they're trying to reverse engineer the vaccine. Then they have to rerun clinical trials. And only then can they start transferring the knowledge to other manufacturers of mRNA COVID-19 vaccines that are located in the global south. So basically, because one company is not willing to share the knowledge that was created by billions of dollars of public funding coming from the American government, we see that we are delaying the rollout of the manufacturing of mRNA COVID-19 vaccines by months, if not years, and it's also much more expensive because you have to rerun all the clinical trials. So yeah, this is a really important issue that should be addressed. How can we better do the technology transfer and make sure that it's not just based in the global north?
Okay, we got a pretty specialist question here, but I think it's really relevant when we're talking corruption, anti-corruption. And the question is, fascinating talk. I'm wondering how freedom of information requests work when governments were required to send non-disclosure agreements when talking with Big Pharma about vaccine deals. So, governments promise to companies to keep this secret, and now you come along and file freedom of information requests. How does that work?
Well, the sad story is that it doesn't. That's the thing. Often when you ask for freedom of information on these kind of things, you'll get back a very redacted document, if you get back a document at all. So I'm willing to share with you a picture of the contract we got from the Oxford AstraZeneca deal. I just need to go to the right slide. Just give me 1 second. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Okay, right. So at the beginning of the pandemic, Oxford made all these very important promises about expedited access for COVID-19 related IP. And we were really interested to see if this was implemented in the contract. But the same as that the government signs non-disclosure agreements with a company, there's also certain things that universities will not disclose, even if you ask them through FOI. So we did ask for the contract, and it took us over a year to get access to it. But then we got a reply, and this is then what the reply looks like. So you'll see at the top that that it says that there is a calculation of the price that the vaccine costs to produce, but they blacked out that whole thing. So in itself, that's of course disappointing because you'd rather see the information, but I think this is a very powerful image as well. So I do really think that even if you know that certain information will not be disclosed, the story of the government not being willing to disclose that information is also a really important information to get out there. So yeah.
Okay, so another question. Someone is wondering, why would you criticize governments for funding research on vaccinations and diversifying their investment strategies? So I guess this goes to governments pre-funding pharma companies to develop vaccines. I mean, not all companies that try to develop a vaccine will be successful in the end. So wasn't it completely appropriate back then for governments to step in and say, yes, we're going to fund private companies massively to shoulder some of the risk and to push this forward? What's your problem with that?
Definitely. Yeah. No, I definitely think that's very important. And as said, we see very much during the COVID-19 pandemic how important mission-oriented health innovation is. So if the governments collectively decide we need to have a health technology that addresses COVID-19, within a year we have several vaccines entering the market. So I think definitely that governments should invest at that stage. However, the question is under what terms and conditions they do it. They could do it under much more transparent conditions. And also, for example, they could have added more clauses saying that if the vaccine doesn't work out, at least that we can use the manufacturing capacity that was created to produce this particular vaccine, to produce vaccines that do work. Because what happened in the end is that one of the mRNA vaccines didn't work out, and there was all this mRNA COVID-19 vaccine production capacity available that then went unused because the particular COVID-19 vaccine they were producing didn't work out. So it's not necessarily that I'm criticizing governments for funding research in vaccinations at this stage. However, I think that we should have thought more about the terms and conditions under which this was done, because I think that's a real thing that we can change. And especially considering that now during the pandemic, there's a lot of new money going into vaccine development and pandemic preparedness. This is also the time and the moment to really prepare for a better global equitable access in the future pandemic, to make sure we don't repeat things that we did wrong in this pandemic.
Okay, so as mentioned, you're pushing back against an industry that's got a turnover worldwide of $1 trillion, $1,000 billion. And someone sends the wonderful question. that industry is presumably making some arguments against sharing COVID vaccine technology. What are the arguments that industry is making that the current status quo is actually good? And what are your counter arguments to that? What are the main points in the debate on both sides?
Well, I would say that there's two main arguments that I hear being thrown around a lot when it comes to the increased sharing of COVID-19 vaccines. So first of all, it is that we need to have high prices of vaccines because we need to recoup the research and development and the risk we took there. Also considering that a lot of health technologies don't work out and don't pass through the clinical trial stage, and we need to recoup this financial investment we make there. However, our counter argument there, especially looking at something like the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, but also at the other vaccines, is that especially the very early research, the very risky research where a lot of things still can go wrong, is funded by the public in the sense of that governments and charities have provided the funding for this early research. So it's not necessarily true that you then need to recoup all this research and development, considering that most of the very risky financing was done by the public. So that's argument one. Argument two is often that that companies will not be able to recreate the vaccine, and that it's very difficult to do proper technology transfer. However, as I showed with the map, there is vaccine experts that have identified 100 companies with potential to make mRNA COVID-19 vaccines. There's a lot of manufacturing sites that Pfizer and Moderna have already been able to repurpose for mRNA vaccines, considering this is completely new technology and actually was not scaled up before the pandemic. So it is definitely doable to do technology transfer, and under the coordination of the World Health Organization in the Technology Transfer Hub in South Africa, I think there is really enough experts and the educational capacity and the technical capacity to do better technology transfer. There's just currently not the willingness to do so, and that is because certain people do very much profit from the current status quo, and they're just not willing to let go of their monopolies.
Okay, we're running out of time. We've only got 1 minute left. We've got a couple of questions that we don't have time to answer, sorry. So just really briefly, Sarai, what would you recommend that people do after this talk? What is one useful thing that people who are joining us today can do?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I actually hadn't think of that. So I think it's very important to keep on challenging the narrative that it's private companies that have created the COVID-19 vaccines. I think what people can do is read up on the public investment that has gone into that and really challenge people that are like giving another narrative and spreading the story of how actually we all together as taxpayers, as the public, have been really, really instrumental in creating a solution for this pandemic, and to leave it at that positive note of always challenging the narrative. That's what I would recommend.
Cool, thanks a lot, and I'll hand back to Elena now.
Okay, thanks to both of you, Till and Sarai, for this really, really extensive insight into the whole vaccine thing. And also I would like to thank you, Till, for the moderation and the collaboration for creating these Disruptive Fridays, and also proposing Sarai and her work to begin with, to really give us the whole insight. And then for the rest of you, really, we are rarely having so many questions. So really thank you for watching and supporting the work of the Disruption Network Lab so far. And thank you for being a super active audience today. And I really hope to see some of you joining our upcoming program and events. So to end appropriately, stay healthy and have a nice weekend. Goodbye, everyone, until the next edition.